Greetings and salutations. Today we will be covering one of America's most mysterious unsolved murder cases, also known as the death of Charles Morgan. The chilling tale of Charles Morgan is considered to be perhaps one of the strangest mysteries in America. His story seems straight out of a movie, from undercover agents, the mafia, to even hitmen, and it has left anyone who delves into his story utterly befuddled. So get ready to take a journey down this bizarre rabbit hole as we try to find out what truly happened in the curious case of Charles Morgan. 39-year-old Charles Morgan was a head escrow agent at Statewide Escrow. However, he would prefer if you just called him Chuck. To many, Chuck was a rather mild-mannered, workaholic individual. However, he did manage to spend time with his family, despite his workaholic nature. It was to the point that he would drive two of his daughters to school every morning. It would be on the morning of March 22nd, 1977, after he had dropped off his daughters at school, then supposedly went to work, that the strangeness would begin. He never made it to the office, vanishing right after having dropped his daughters off at school. Neither hide nor hair would be seen of him for what would be a total of 3 days. It wouldn't be until March 25th, in the early hours, and I mean early hours of the morning, at 2 a.m. to be precise, that Chuck would make his way back to his family. According to his wife, Ruth Morgan, he looked absolutely disheveled. He was missing a shoe. He had a set of plastic handcuffs around one of his ankles, along with having plastic zip ties keeping his hands locked together. It had appeared as if he had escaped from something or someone. However, what she first realized was that for some reason he was unable to speak, yet she could easily tell that he was beyond terrified. Ruth attempted to ascertain where her husband had been for the past 3 days. However, all that Chuck was able to do was write in order to communicate with her. He had written down that he had been captured, tortured, and that his captors had applied a hallucinogenic to the inside of his throat. He would go on to say that the substance would drive him mad or irrevocably damage his nervous system. However, he was unable to or unwilling to name those who had done such harm to him. Instead, he requested that Ruth move the car in order to keep them from finding out that he had come home. Ruth did as she was asked to, and proceeded to attempt to contact the police afterwards. However, before she could, she was stopped. Her husband had written down, "If you call the cops, they'll kill all of us, even the girls." Ruth went on to state, "I wanted to call a doctor and the police," but he was adamant that that would be signing a death warrant for the entire family. Chuck would hide out in the family home for the following 7 days, and during these days, Ruth would feed him with an eyedropper, aiding him in his recovery as best she could. And while there was no substantial physical damage to recover from, mentally, it would be another story altogether. However, before his voice had fully returned, he would confess to his wife that he had been working covertly for the federal government under the Office of the Treasury Department, specifically helping them target organized crime and aiding in cases where the mob was attempting to defraud the government. He wrote that they took my Treasury ID, whomever they were. Chuck was tight-lipped about their identity. This was around the time that Chuck would start wearing body armor wherever he went, never being without it, making certain that his daughters would never have to walk to or from school. It would be during this time that he would tell his father that he had hidden a letter somewhere within the house that detailed everything of the entire situation. Yet, he requested that his father not tell Ruth about it to keep her from looking for it as long as he was alive. 2 months had passed, and nary a bump in the night had occurred, leading Ruth to start believing that whatever had happened was long over. However, the Morgan family would not be that lucky. Charles would once more vanish on June 7th as he drove to work and staying missing 9 days. That's when the family would receive a call from an unidentified woman. The call goes as follows. "Ruthie? Yes? Chuck is all right." Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8. With that final utterance, the unknown woman hung up. Recognizing this as a Bible passage, Ruth looked for hers and immediately flipped through to the correct page and passage. It goes as follows. "Men are afraid of a high place and of terrors on the road. Remember him before the silver cord is broken and the golden bowl is crushed. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it." It would be 2 days after having received the cryptic message that Charles' body would be found dead in the desert by San Juan Springs. His body had been dead for at least 12 hours before being found. He was wearing his soft body armor. However, he had been shot through the back of the head. He had been shot with his own .357 Magnum, which was found lying beside him. Confoundingly enough, no fingerprints were found on the gun, or on anything else in the crime scene. There was gunshot residue found on his left hand, indicating that he had fired the weapon, or a weapon in general. Chuck was also wearing his belt with a hidden knife sheathed into its buckle. Detectives quickly found his car, and strangely enough, they found a note giving directions to the crime scene, written in his hand. Also in the car were several weapons, along with ammunition and a CB radio. Strangely enough, one of his teeth was also found wrapped in a white handkerchief within the car. There was also a pair of sunglasses found in the car, which did not belong to Chuck. The strangest thing, however, was a $2 bill that had been clipped to the inside of Chuck's underwear. Written on the bill were 7 Spanish surnames from the letters A to G, along with having Ecclesiastes 12 written on it, with the verses 1 through 8 marked by arrows drawn on the bill's serial number. This was the same reference the female caller had made to Ruth. On the back of the bill, where the signers had Declaration of Independence, were the numbers 1 through 7. Also, a crude map was drawn on the same side. This map showed roads between Tucson and the Mexican border. The towns, specifically of Robles Junction and Sasbe, were notably marked. These towns are infamously known for smuggling. This raises a question as to what was the rationale for the clue to be left in the way it was. And it causes us to ask, did he leave it himself, or had someone else planted the clue on his body? What was the Bible passage supposed to mean? And since the reference was once more made, this brought the question of who the woman who called Ruth was into focus. In spite of all this, investigators were quick to rule out anything other than suicide, stating that Chuck had taken his own life, saying he had done this due to fear for his own safety or financial difficulties. This confused many people since it seemed very out of the norm for someone who had gone as far as to wear a bulletproof vest every day to commit suicide. His wife went so far as to say that Chuck would never leave his girls. There's also the investigative reporter who has strongly pushed for further investigation and an attempt to solve the case. Don Devereux stated that, "I have never seen in all my years as a journalist a fellow take himself out in the desert wearing a bulletproof vest and shoot himself in the back of the head." It must be noted that there were some investigators, though few, that had suspected the death was something other than suicide. It would be 2 days after Chuck's death that a mysterious woman called the Pima County Sheriff's Office and spoke with an officer of the department on the telephone. She claimed that her nickname was Green Eyes and that she was the same woman that had called Ruth several days earlier. Green Eyes had stated that in the weeks preceding Chuck's death, he had been hiding in a local motel and that he was supposed to meet her at the local motel shortly before he died. She also claimed that she had visited him at that same motel and that Chuck had a suitcase brimming with thousands of dollars in cash. He had told her that the money was to pay off a killer, an assassin really, that was after him. Supposedly someone had put a $90,000 bounty on his head and the payout was increasing at a rate by $5,000 a day. And supposedly that he intended to buy back his life by meeting the hitman that day and paying him off. Whatever version of these events is true is unfortunately as of yet unknown. And to this day no one knows who Green Eyes actually was or her connection to Chuck. However, since she did call Ruth with a message, and that same message was the one on the dollar bill that was found tucked inside Chuck's underwear, it does seem hard to say that she was not linked to Chuck in some way or to the case as a whole. This raises the potential question, was she a friend, an enemy, or potentially the person who took Chuck's life away from him? Shortly after his death, 2 well-dressed men came to Ruth's home and knocked. They claimed to be FBI agents, flashing their badges. However, they did so particularly too fast for Ruth to get any real look at them. or to note if they were real or fake. Ruth would go on to state that they had said that they wanted to come in and look through the house. They never said what they were looking for. Ruth had felt too intimidated by them to ask, especially so shortly after her husband's death, to the point that she was unable to even get the agents' names. Whomever they were, they turned her house upside down, searching, looking for something. It is believed that if the letter that Chuck had supposedly hidden in the house was real at all, the men would have potentially been looking for it, and could also have potentially have found the letter, since to this day nobody knows the location of the supposed letter. It must be noted that shortly after Chuck's death and before the FBI supposedly contacted Chuck's wife, his impounded car was broken into while it was in police custody. Around that same time, his office was also ransacked, along with the car being torn apart, showed that whomever had done so had been desperate to find something in particular. During his investigation, Don Devereaux would go on to state, "When I made a Freedom of Information Act request, FOIA, to the FBI, they said that they had never heard of Charles Morgan, despite the fact that they had obviously opened an investigation into him. Despite the fact that the FBI interviewed Morgan's attorney, and that they were all over this like a blanket for a while, but now they've never heard of the guy. He never existed. No card, no file, nothing." There were also several rumors milling about that included that Chuck was killed because he was involved in illegal activity or doing secret work for the government, or even that he had decided to end his own life and chosen to leave a bunch of clues in order to leave anyone and everyone in a post-mortem wild goose chase, to essentially immortalize himself as a mystery. As it stands, his death seems just as unexplained as the events leading up to it. Now, going into the theories. Starting with the suicide theory, which was proposed by the government itself and the authorities. The suicide theory is supported by the fact that the fatal gunshot came from his own gun. However, it would not necessarily mean that he was the one who shot it. To complicate things even further, the gunshot residue was found on his left hand, whilst Chuck was right-handed. And I don't know you, but I find using a firearm in your offhand as a rather difficult task to believe anyone committing suicide would attempt to do, especially when firing at the back of the head. It also begs the question, why would somebody who is committing suicide continue to wear a bulletproof vest, even to his death, while noting how uncomfortable they can be, especially in the temperature and the weather of the area? And this would completely have to overlook the fact that some of the evidence was found in his car belonged to somebody else. That, along with the Bible passage which was mentioned not only in the dollar bill slipped in his pant, but to the phone call to his wife, does bring to question what happened as potentially not being suicide. That, along with the CCTV footage showing that Chuck had actually met with someone who is potentially Green Eyes, makes calling this an outright suicide a significantly more unbelievable claim. The second theory was that he was an undercover agent executed in the line of duty after his cover had been made. Chuck had told his wife that he had been working with the government against the mob. The fact that the FBI would act as if they had no connections to him, and as if the case didn't even exist, regardless of there being evidence of such, brings up suspicions of a cover-up. It was noted that it was abundantly clear that Chuck was in mortal danger, and potentially the $2 bill could have been an attempt to message his handler, or an agent of some sort. Others believed that his actions mirrored more those of an agent who had found wrongdoing between the government and or governmental bodies, leading to an assassination. However, the biggest fault in this theory is the fact that there is no solid evidence that ties Chuck conclusively to any agency or an agent directly working with the government in any way. Now, the third theory goes along similar lines. It states that Chuck potentially was working for the mob. Although Chuck claimed that he was working against organized crime, some believed he was involved with organized crime, believing that he had embezzled funds or knew too much. And it is important to remember that during the 1970s, Tucson, along with other cities in Arizona, had become a drawing point for the mob, and they had become heavily invested in it. Due to its warm climate and the particular stance of the criminal justice system. This was led by former New York Don Joseph Bonanno. It is known that more than 500 racketeers and members of the mob had moved into Tucson and the area surrounding it during the 1970s. This led to several gangland-style killings in the area, After this story had appeared on Unsolved Mysteries, the TV show, there was a slew of tips that came in claiming that Chuck had been involved in money laundering, along with taking part in other illegal transactions with the use of gold, platinum, and silver. Allegedly, his job allowed him to facilitate mob transactions due to the blind trust laws in Arizona, and working as an escrow agent protected Chuck and his clients, which meant that they would have been the only ones allowed to see the accounts and what was done with them. On occasion, Chuck had mentioned to Ruth that money laundering was occurring in Tucson. However, he claimed that he was not involved in it. He also stated that the less she and the children knew about his activities, the better it would be for them. It is theorized that Chuck was killed by members of an organized crime syndicate. It is possible that one of the mafia families that he worked with had him killed because he knew too much, or he was working with an opposing family. Unfortunately, none of these theories have been confirmed, and it is likely that none of them ever will, and the mystery will remain. If you have remained with me until the end, I thank you, and I do hope you stay tuned and subscribe for more content.